Hello, my name's Hannes, this is Painting by Letters, and today I want to talk about pinning. As we're getting further and further through the boarding patrol box, a problem has sort of arisen. You see, the warriors are quite a stable unit, their arms connect into a gun, meaning that you have quite a lot of points where glue will connect the model together. The further we get through the box, however, the spindlier they're becoming. Okay, so I couldn't think of a good way to explain pinning when I was doing the bit to camera, so just cut it out. So we're going to do it here instead. I'm going to point out that this is obviously part of the Growing the Necrons series as well. So as we're working through the boarding patrol, initially we've got the warriors, then after that we've got the Lychguard, which is this video, and soon to come we'll have the Ophidian destroyers as well. So let's just discuss gluing a little bit first. Plastic glue creates a chemical bond. That chemical bond is incredibly solid. However, it can take a little while to dry. It strips paint. And the other problem with it stripping paint is that then the plastic glue becomes diluted with the paint as well, and it makes the bond less effective. Super glue, on the other hand, creates a much weaker bond, but it dries super quick and it doesn't strip the paint underneath. It can create problems where it covers the paint with a thin film that can look pretty ugly, but it's quite easy to clean that up with just a little bit of paintwork. Pinning fixes the problems with superglue. So let's discuss the actual problem itself. If you've got two pieces of plastic and you've got paint creates a bit of a layer. When you're gluing into that layer. Plastic glue won't easily reach the plastic because of the layer of paint. Superglue will glue these two pieces together, but it'll be incredibly brittle, really easy to snap off. I know that there are tournament gamers and people like that who really like it like that. They're doing something different for a different purpose than me. I like building a unit once and having it, so that doesn't particularly work for me. However, if we put a pin in instead, in this case let's say a metallic piece of paperclip, the two pieces of plastic and the paint now have a pin going straight through the middle. So this stops your sort of lateral movement between the two pieces. So when the glue goes in the middle, there's a problem with plastic glue, which is that it can't bond plastic to metal. So plastic glue is no better in this scenario than it would be in the other one, but super glue can bond the two parts together, and yet the pin stops that bond from being brittle by supplying the rigidity against that lateral force. I hope that made sense. So yeah, that's sort of the idea. Let's see, with some paper clips and with a cheap drill, if we can pin models together and hopefully the super glue will work to hold them in place, meaning that those elements that would cover detail and make it harder to paint will be easier to put on after we've already painted them. So I went through the box initially at first, and this is where the problem really appeared quite obvious. Lots of the bonds are very small, and lots of the parts are actually quite large. So particularly on the limbs, you have, let's say, an arm extending outwards that then has that quite large shield on it. That shield is going to be so easy to knock in the final product that it was really clear that something had to be put in place to stop that happening. Since filming this video, I've actually built the destroyers for the next Necron video already, and in building those, I actually dropped one of them, and in the process of dropping it, it just shattered to pieces, even though it had been glued very meticulously. And that's because lots of those spaces where the glue goes in are actually quite small. The same is true with these Lychguard as well. The models have very thin, spindly bits that are going to be really easy to knock, really easy to damage, really easy to get caught on stuff. This also brings to mind the fact that in the not too distant future, I'm going to actually be teaching a friend of mine how to play Warhammer 40k. I'm doing this kind of week of hobbying where I'm spending every evening throughout this week getting ready for my friend coming to visit. And these Lychguard were the first sort of day of this. And when you're working at speed like that, you can't really afford for things to go wrong. You'll see during this video that some stuff really does, but you need to be able to rely upon the work that you've already done with plastic glue. Especially, it's not always immediately obvious once glued whether the bond is actually any good, and usually you find it out when you're hand holding the model, sometimes days, sometimes weeks later. So finding an alternate method, particularly for those things that are going to get knocked a lot, seems like a really valuable thing to do, and that's where the idea of this video really comes from. Obviously I could have built the Lychguard as Triarch Praetorians as well. I do like the look of those models, they just don't really suit what I want to do somehow. I quite like the methodical, marching, endless tide of Necrons, and the alternate build type, it just looks a bit too active somehow, I don't know. So they're all going to be Lychguard, and one of the things that I do want to do in the future, once I've finally got my 2000 points of Necron sorted, which we're so close to now, is probably to get another unit or two of Lychguard as well. So now the Lychguard models have come together, it's worth talking about how I initially decided to prep this for pinning. Because obviously the main models themselves are quite enclosed when you've got the shields on, I really wanted the shield separate for the painting process. So my idea essentially is to just pin the shields. As it's a bit of a test anyway, it doesn't really matter if the whole model is pinned, just anything that's going to be particularly at risk of catching on something else or snapping off, something like that. These shields, as quite large components, are going to do that. They're also going to obscure a lot of the body for painting. So giving the option, I decided to have the shields slightly separately. I did make a mistake in a couple of places. I cut slightly too close to the shield. It's really obvious when you look at them quite close, and that's because I didn't really like the blocks at the back of the shield all that much. One of the things that this method accidentally allows us to do is to test the difference between the swords and the shields, because the swords are just using plastic glue and the shields are using pins and super glue. So we can at least see the difference between them. I'm not going to snap my own models, but at the end I'm at least able to sort of test the two of them off each other and see how they feel. So once primed, it's just my usual recipe. We'll go through it in a bit of a quick pace just so you can kind of see the whole process, I guess. So Agrax Earthshade over absolutely everything as an initial tint. I do this straight out the pot. I don't do anything impressive with it. It's just to cover the whole model, and I find it dulls down the lead belcher quite nicely as well. I think I've talked about that before. So same as I've done previously, Vallejo's light blue across the rib cages. This just creates a bit of visual difference from the rest of the model, but it's still quite cold, which means that some of the warmer parts stand out quite a lot as well. It offsets from the Agrax as well, because that leans slightly to the warmer side of things as browns go. If you do want to follow this at home, just make sure 2 thin coats on this. This layer really has to be solid, otherwise the subsequent layers I think often don't make it look right somehow. One of the things I wanted to do during this painting was to bring in some of the things that I did with the Void Dragon into my smaller units. In this case, what I want to bring in is the way that I did those greens, because I really liked that effect. And I was curious if I could create that effect on a smaller surface area. And given that these models were already kind of test models for pinning anyway, I thought it was a bit of a space to just have a bit of fun and see what I could do. One thing I found during that process is I found stippling. I don't know if it's the brushes I've got, I'm not sure. Didn't quite create the coverage that I wanted, or really the accuracy when I was doing the Void Dragon. So I decided to actually paint the greens in manually as a base layer. So it's just very traditional, just a watered down green. In this case it's Warpstone Glow. 2 thin coats, just going over everything to make sure that it's a proper vibrant green that we can then dry brush over the top and see if that same dry brushing effect works on a smaller area. So you can see that I've taken the Achelian green again, watered it down, basically get it the consistency of a glaze, and you just put it over all of those blue elements. It just dampens it down a little bit. The next thing you can see me doing here is layering in the red for the weapons. Again, with these weapons I'm going to do some more dry brushing effects, but for that to work we need a really solid base colour to work up from. While I was waiting for some of those coats to dry, I decided to put in the texture paste. That gives that plenty of time to dry before we're ever going to really think about doing the basing. And this is where I start the dry brush process. Starting initially with War Boss green. I really like this green colour as being quite a desaturated green. That Warpstone, it's quite rich, it's somewhat cool as well. And as I like ending lots of models with quite bright colours, but also quite warm colours as well, going through this kind of intermediate, slightly washed out phase creates the transition really nicely, I think. So as well as working that through the shields, I'm also going to be working that through all of the shoulder pads on the models as well. So this is where disaster struck. I annoyingly don't have a recording of this happening, but my orange paint just exploded on me and I only had one day to do this. So I thought, sod it, I'm just going to carry on. If I've lost all of that orange paint, then at least I can use some of it, I suppose. So initially I tried to layer it, didn't really like it, and then I thought I'd just move to the dry brushing. So you can see me here basically dry brushing the oranges over, same way that I would do the greens, and then coming in with yellows as well. I'm not entirely sure this was super successful. It's a take on something similar at least, and it produces a similar effect. I, at this point, then had a hell of a lot of cleaning to do, given that that orange had gone absolutely everywhere. I did quite a lot of that off camera. And then it was getting quite late. This had to be done on the same day. And this is where I think I properly started making mistakes, if I'm honest. Started experimenting with golds. I don't like Vallejo's gold. I don't know why I was using it, but I decided to anyway. And then it never quite works as I wanted it to. And then I thought, well, it's fine because I'll just contrast over everything. And this is exactly when the smart move would have been to put tools down, go to bed and come back the next day. But I was incensed at this point with the orange and then I had to do something. So I ended up using Shylish Purple to go over the golds. It doesn't work at all. You'll see it in the final images. I'm definitely fixing that. I did some work on the basing. I tried to touch some stuff up, but again, it just wasn't really working for me in a lot of ways. But you know, I guess that's not really the point of this video. And although I think the Lychguard look alright, there's definitely stuff I would change. For the sake of clarity, I did come back the next day and do some cleaning up as well. Just trying to push some of the vibrancies on some of the yellows because I didn't really like them the night before. So finally we get to pinning the models. What I'm using here is just a really dirt cheap hobby drill off Amazon. It's nothing special, nothing really to write home about. Even this dirt cheap drill just glides through the plastic in the models dead simply. It creates a channel. I found a drill bit that was about the same size, if perhaps ever so slightly larger than the paper clips. So once the paper clips were cut to size, it was as simple as just drilling the hole in the other side and then gluing it together. You might quite reasonably question why I'm using a gel super glue here rather than a more liquid super glue, which you might expect for things like this. I find the gel one to be really useful when you need to fill a gap. And so what I was doing is I was dropping the gel super glue over the metal, pushing the metal pin into the channel that I've drilled in. And then once I'd done that, that meant that that gel super glue would just seep out and it would just create a bit more of a connection bond between the two bits of painted plastic as well. So yeah, that's kind of it. I've experimented a bit in this video. I've tried to bring in some of the techniques I used in the Void Dragon into a more traditional unit. I've changed my recipe for the blades. I'm not perfectly happy with it, but I think there's something there. And the pinning seemingly has worked. They're rock solidly attached, even with only a mil or two's worth of paperclip inside the plastic. It's holding it completely still. One of the things that I have noticed is that the shields feel much more strongly attached than the swords do, even though the swords arguably have the same amount of connection. They were just plastic glued together. So even in comparison, I think it's fair to say that the super glue is probably stronger when reinforced than the plastic glue is unreinforced, at least. There are definitely things that I would change about these models. I've got a whole batch of metallic paints arriving actually today, supposedly. I'm probably going to redo all of the sort of coloured golds that I attempted to do. And there's definitely some cleanup work that needed to be done, but after that paint pot exploded on me, I was in a bad mood last night and I had to get this video out today. So yeah, there's definitely things that I would fix and I would change, but all said, as a bit of a proof of concept, a bit of a test, it's worked. And I also actually really like the shields, just with having that kind of blended green on them again. So to close, I'll just say thank you so much for watching. I've been Hannes, this has been Painting by Letters, and keep safe out there.